A 12-year-old boy on a rusted BMX bicycle just rode straight into the oil-stained garage of the most feared motorcycle club in Harlan County. He didn't come looking for trouble. He came carrying a phone full of footage that could destroy some of the most powerful people in this town. The kind of footage that makes people disappear. The kind of truth that gets buried under concrete and silence. Nobody sent him. Nobody protected him. He pedaled through freezing rain and fog because every adult in his life told him to stop asking questions. And he couldn't. What happens next will shake you. Stay with me until the very end of this one, because this story goes places you won't see coming. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from tonight, and let's ride. The fluorescent lights inside the Harlan County Community Outreach Center had been dying for 6 months. 2 of the long tubes flickered in a pattern that made everything beneath them look like it was shaking. The third had gone dark completely, leaving the back corner of the donation sorting room in permanent shadow. Nobody had replaced them. Nobody had filed a request. The center's director, a thin woman named Mrs. Calloway with reading glasses perpetually crooked on her face, said the budget didn't allow for it. She said that about everything. Eli Mercer stood at the folding table beneath the one working light, his hands moving through canned goods with the mechanical rhythm of someone who'd been doing this since he was 9. Green beans on the left, corn on the right. Anything dented went into the box underneath. He didn't look up when the back door opened. He didn't need to. It was Tuesday. He already knew what was coming. The white cargo van backed into the loading area at exactly 4:47 p.m. Same time every week. Same driver. A heavy-set man in a gray windbreaker who never made eye contact with anyone and never spoke beyond one-word instructions. Same 2 volunteers who appeared from nowhere, loaded boxes with strange efficiency, and vanished before the families started arriving at 5. Eli watched from the corner of his eye. 43 boxes today. He'd counted. Last week it was 38. The week before, 41. The numbers were going up, but the shelves inside the center were going down. His mother Nina stood at the front counter, her back to the loading dock, signing families in with a clipboard that had been photocopied so many times the lines were barely visible. She looked thinner than she had in September. Her wrists were bony. Her hair, pulled into a ponytail so tight it seemed to stretch the skin at her temples, hadn't been washed since Sunday. She worked 2 jobs. Mornings at a dry cleaner that smelled like chemicals strong enough to make your eyes water, evenings here. Volunteering because she believed in what the center was supposed to do. Eli watched her hand a single bag of groceries to Mrs. Delgado, who had 4 kids and a husband who'd been gone since spring. 1 bag, 4 kids, and 43 boxes just rolled out the back door. Mom. Nina didn't look up. Not now, Eli. The van took more than last week. Eli. Her voice had that edge, the one that meant she was too tired to argue and too afraid to listen. Those go to the satellite locations. Mrs. Calloway explained it. There aren't any satellite locations. Nina's pen stopped, just for a second. Then it moved again. Go finish sorting. He stood there long enough to feel the weight of everything she wouldn't say. Then he turned back to the canned goods, pressing his thumbnail into the label of a dented can of peaches until the paper tore. The van pulled away. The loading dock door rolled shut. The flickering lights buzzed like trapped insects. Nobody questioned it. That was the part that made Eli's stomach feel like it was full of cold water. Not the van, not the boxes, the silence. Every adult in this building saw the same thing he saw, and every single one of them looked the other way. Mrs. Calloway smiled too much. The volunteers moved too fast. The driver never stayed long enough for anyone to memorize his face. And his mother who'd taught him that lying was the one thing she'd never tolerate, signed families in and handed out bags that were half the size they'd been a year ago and said nothing. Eli zipped his jacket to the chin and walked out the front door into the kind of cold that Harlan County specialized in. Wet, gray, seeping into your bones through your clothes like it had a personal grudge. His BMX leaned against the chain-link fence where he'd left it, the front tire low, the handlebars wrapped in electrical tape where the rubber grip had torn off last summer. He threw his leg over the seat and pedaled toward home, his breath visible in the mist, his backpack bouncing against his spine. But he didn't go home. He'd mapped the van's route 3 Tuesdays ago. Not on purpose. He'd been riding to the library and saw it turning off Gresham Avenue, which made no sense if it was heading to any of the addresses Mrs. Calloway had mentioned during her monthly reports. The van went south. The satellite locations, if they existed, were north. Eli had checked. He'd walked into the public library, pulled up the Outreach Center's website on a computer with a sticky keyboard, and found exactly 0 references to satellite distribution points. The only address listed was the center itself. Tonight, the mist was thick enough to swallow sound. Eli stayed 2 blocks behind the van, pedaling slowly, keeping to the sidewalks where the streetlights had burned out. Past the boarded-up Dollar General. Past the parking lot of the old textile mill where puddles collected in cracked asphalt like dark mirrors. Past the railroad crossing where the warning lights hadn't worked since before he was born. The van turned onto Industrial Row. Eli's legs burned. Industrial Row was a stretch of forgotten warehouses and rusted fencing that ran along the river for almost a mile. No houses, no businesses, no reason for a food donation van to be anywhere near it. He stopped behind a dumpster and pulled out his phone. The screen was cracked from when he dropped it in the school bathroom 3 months ago. The camera still worked. He held it steady with both hands and hit record. The van backed into an open bay at the far end of a warehouse that looked like it hadn't been legally occupied in a decade. The bay door was already open. Lights on inside, not the dying fluorescence of the Outreach Center, but bright industrial work lights that threw hard shadows across the concrete floor. The driver got out. 2 men Eli had never seen before appeared from inside. They weren't wearing the volunteer vests from the center. They wore dark jackets and moved with the kind of purpose that said they'd done this 100 times. 43 boxes. Out of the van, into the warehouse. Eli counted every single one. Then something happened that made his blood go cold. The driver got back in the van, empty now, and pulled out of the bay. But instead of heading back toward the center, he turned east. Eli knew east. East took you past the rail yard, through the old lumber district, and directly past the compound where the Black Forge riders kept their clubhouse. The van drove slowly, deliberately, like a car in a parade, past the chain-link fence topped with razor wire, past the row of Harleys parked under a corrugated metal overhang, past the hand-painted sign that said Black Forge. No entry in letters that had been touched up so many times the paint was thick as skin. Then the van accelerated and disappeared. Eli stood there in the dark, his phone still recording, his sneakers soaked through, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his teeth. The route didn't make sense unless you thought about it the wrong way, unless you thought about what someone wanted other people to believe. The van didn't stop at the clubhouse. It just drove past it. Slowly, visibly, on a street with 3 security cameras mounted on telephone poles that the city had installed 2 years ago after a string of break-ins that everyone blamed on the bikers. Somebody wanted it on camera. The van, the route, the connection, a straight line from stolen donations to the most hated address in Harlan County. Eli's hands were shaking, not from the cold. He rode home in the dark, his tire hissing on wet pavement, his mind running faster than his legs could pedal. He locked his bike to the porch railing with a cable lock that could be cut with kitchen scissors and went inside. The apartment smelled like the space heater his mother ran in the kitchen because the building's furnace hadn't worked properly since October. He dropped his backpack by the door and sat on the edge of his bed in the room he shared with the water heater and stared at his phone screen, watching the footage play back in silence. Boxes. Warehouse, van, clubhouse. The loop played 3 times before he heard his mother's key in the lock. Nina came in looking like she'd been rained on from the inside. Her eyes were red. Her coat was damp. She set a single grocery bag on the counter, the same bag she could have given to Mrs. Delgado's kids, and started pulling out a can of soup, a loaf of bread that was 2 days from its expiration date, and a bag of rice that weighed maybe a pound. "You eat yet?" she asked, without turning around. "No?" "I'll heat the soup." He wanted to show her the video. He wanted to put the phone in her hands and say, look at what's happening. Look at where the food goes." But he knew what she'd do. She'd tell him to delete it. She'd say it wasn't their business. She'd remind him that she needed the volunteer hours on her resume for the county job she'd been applying to for 8 months, and that making trouble at the center would end that. She'd be right about all of it. and wrong about the only part that mattered. So he said nothing. He ate the soup. He went to bed with his phone under his pillow and the video file burning a hole in his chest. 3 days later, Eli did something that every adult in his life would have called insane. He rode his BMX to the Black Forge Riders compound. It was a Friday. School had let out at 2:30. The sky was the color of a bruise, purple-gray, heavy, pressing down on the rooftops like it was trying to crush the town flat. Eli pedaled past the rail yard, past the lumber district, past the 3 cameras on their telephone poles, and stopped at the gate. The compound was bigger than it looked from the street. Behind the chain-link fence, a gravel lot spread out in front of a long, low building with a corrugated roof and walls made of cinder block that had been painted black so many times the surface looked like leather. A row of motorcycles, 10, maybe 12, sat under the overhang, chrome, catching what little light the sky offered. The bay door on the left was open. Inside, someone was working on an engine. The sound was thick, metallic, rhythmic, a wrench turning, a bolt dropping into a pan, the hiss of compressed air. Eli got off his bike. His legs felt like they belonged to someone else. He walked to the gate and stood there, his hand on the chain link, his fingers threading through the diamond-shaped gaps in the wire. A man appeared in the bay door. He was tall, wide-shouldered, wearing a leather vest over a thermal shirt that had been black once and was now the color of graphite. His head was shaved. A scar ran from his left ear to the corner of his jaw, a thin white line against weathered skin. He held a rag in one hand and a socket wrench in the other, and he looked at Eli the way you'd look at a bird that had flown into a room it didn't belong in. Not angry, not threatening, just confused about how it got there. "You lost, kid?" Eli's voice came out smaller than he wanted. "No." The man didn't move. Behind him, inside the garage, Eli could see another figure sitting on an overturned crate, a cigarette between his fingers, watching. The smoke curled up into the fluorescent light and disappeared. "Then you're in the wrong place for a reason." The man with the scar set the wrench down on a workbench. "Talk fast." "I need to see Mason Creed." Something changed in the air. The man with the scar glanced back at the figure on the crate. The figure on the crate stood up, slowly, the way someone stands when their knees have been carrying too much weight for too many years. He dropped the cigarette and ground it out with the heel of a boot that looked like it had walked through things Eli couldn't imagine. "Who told you that name?" the man with the scar asked. "Nobody. Everyone knows." The man on the crate walked forward into the light. He was older than the first ones, maybe 50, maybe 60. Impossible to tell exactly because his face had the kind of lines that came from damage, not age. His hair was steel gray, cut close. His eyes were dark, quiet, and when they landed on Eli, they stayed there like they were reading something written on the boy's skin. "You're Nina Mercer's boy," he said. Not a question. Eli nodded. The man, Mason Creed, looked at him for a long time. Long enough for the wind to push a sheet of newspaper across the gravel lot and pin it against the fence. Long enough for the fluorescent tube above the bay door to flicker once and recover. "Come inside," Mason said. "Don't touch anything." The garage smelled like engine oil and cold metal and the ghost of 1,000 cigarettes that had been smoked between these walls over decades. Workbenches lined the left side, covered in tools arranged with a precision that surprised Eli. Every wrench in order, every socket in its tray, rags folded, not crumpled. On the right, a row of motorcycles in various states of repair, their engines exposed like open chests, wires and hoses and chrome catching the overhead light. Against the back wall, a battered couch, a coffee maker that looked older than Eli, and a corkboard covered in photographs, most of them faded, some of them showing men in uniform standing in places that didn't look like America. The man with the scar, Eli would learn his name was Dutch, leaned against the workbench and crossed his arms. 2 other men drifted in from a side door. One was young, maybe late 20s, with tattoos covering both forearms and a limp he tried to hide. The other was older, bearded, wearing a flannel shirt under his vest, his hands wrapped in the kind of medical tape that fighters use. They didn't speak. They just stood where they could see. Mason poured coffee into a ceramic mug that had lost its handle and held it out. Eli shook his head. Mason shrugged, took a sip, and set it on the workbench. "Talk." Eli pulled out his phone. His hands were steadier now than they'd been at the gate. Something about this place, the oil, the silence, the way these men stood without fidgeting, without performing, made the shaking stop. He unlocked the screen and hit play. The video was shaky. The lighting was bad, but it showed everything. The van, the warehouse, the boxes being unloaded by men who weren't volunteers, and then the van's deliberate cruise past the Black Forge compound. Slow, visible, staged. Nobody said a word until the video ended. Dutch looked at Mason. The young man with the tattoos shifted his weight off his bad leg. The bearded man unwrapped the tape from his right hand and rewrapped it, tighter. Mason picked up his coffee, took another sip, set it down. The ceramic made a small, sharp sound against the metal workbench. How long has this been going on? His voice was flat, not angry, not surprised. The voice of a man who'd learned a long time ago that the world worked exactly like this and had spent years trying to forget it. At least since September, Eli said. Probably longer. The shelves at the center have been getting emptier all year. Mrs. Calloway says it's supply chain problems, but the van comes every week. The boxes are full. They're just not going where they're supposed to. And they drive past us on the way out. Every time, same route, past your cameras, past the city cameras on the poles, like they want someone to see. Mason leaned back. His eyes went to the corkboard on the wall, to a photograph in the upper right corner that Eli couldn't make out from where he stood, but that Mason seemed to see clearly, even from 10 feet away. Whatever was in that picture held him for 3 full seconds. They're building a frame, Dutch said quietly. Donations go missing, people get hungry, and when somebody finally asks where the food went, there's a nice clean trail that leads right to our front door. It's not the first time, the bearded man said. His voice was a low rasp, like he'd swallowed smoke. Won't be the last. Mason didn't respond to either of them. He was still looking at Eli, looking at a 12-year-old kid in soaked sneakers and a jacket 2 sizes too big who'd ridden a broken bicycle through the rain to knock on the door of the most feared men in Harlan County because no one else would listen. Your mama know you're here? No? She'd skin you alive. Probably. The ghost of something that might have been a smile crossed Mason's face. It was gone before it fully arrived. Kid, I want you to listen carefully. What you did, riding here, showing us this, took guts. More guts than most grown men have. But what you're looking at isn't just a van and some boxes. You're looking at people with money, people with connections, people who've been doing this long enough to have every exit covered. You understand what that means? Eli didn't answer right away. The coffee maker gurgled behind him. The wind pushed against the bay door and made the metal groan. It means they know how to make problems go away, Eli said. Mason stared at him. Then he picked up the mug again, and this time when he drank, he drained it. Dutch. Yeah. Call Rowan. Something shifted in the room. Dutch's arms uncrossed. The young man with the tattoos looked up sharply. The bearded man stopped wrapping his hand. You sure? Dutch asked. The kid rode through the rain. Least we can do is make a phone call. Dutch pulled a phone from his vest pocket. Not a smartphone, an old flip phone with a scratched screen, and stepped out the side door. The garage was quiet except for the wind and the distant sound of a truck downshifting on the highway. Mason looked at Eli one more time. There was something in his expression that Eli wouldn't understand for years, a mixture of admiration and grief. The look of a man watching someone walk toward a fire they couldn't see yet. Go home, Mason said. Don't tell your mother. Don't tell anyone. Don't go back to that warehouse. Don't follow the van again. You ride your bike to school, you ride your bike home, and you wait. Wait for what? Mason set the empty mug upside down on the workbench. The ceramic clicked against metal. In the silence that followed, Eli could hear every man in that room breathing. For the sound of engines. Eli rode home in the dark. The mist had thickened into something closer to fog, and the streetlights on his block turned the air a sickly orange. His mother was already asleep on the couch, the television still on, the space heater humming its low electric drone. He put a blanket over her without waking her up. He brushed his teeth with cold water because the hot water heater was broken again. He lay in bed and stared at the ceiling and felt something he couldn't name, something between terror and hope, stretched so thin it hummed like a wire. 4 blocks away, in a garage that smelled like oil and coffee and decades of silence, Mason Creed stood alone in front of the corkboard. His hand rested on the photograph in the upper right corner, a young woman in a summer dress, smiling, standing next to a motorcycle that gleamed like it had never been ridden. He didn't take the photo down. He just stood there, touching the edge of it with his thumb, his jaw set, his eyes focused on something far past the wall. Dutch came back through the side door. The cold followed him in. "Rowan's coming, tomorrow night." Mason nodded without turning around. "She's going to want everything. The kids' footage, our security tapes, the route maps, everything we've got on anyone who's tried to set us up in the last 3 years. I know what she wants." Dutch paused. He'd known Mason for 22 years. He'd watched him bury friends, rebuild engines at 3 in the morning, and sit through interrogations without blinking. He'd never seen the man look afraid. But right now, standing in the low light with his hand on that photograph, Mason Creed looked like a man who'd just heard a sound he'd been dreading for a very long time. "Mason, what aren't you telling me?" The fluorescent light above them flickered. The motorcycles sat in their row, chrome catching shadows. Somewhere outside, a train horn sounded. Long, low, fading into the fog like a voice calling from a place that didn't exist on any map. Mason pulled his hand away from the photograph. When he turned around, his face was the face Eli had seen at the gate. Calm, unreadable, carved from something harder than stone. "The warehouse on Industrial Row," Mason said quietly. "I know who owns it." Dutch waited. "And when Rowan starts pulling threads, she's going to find out why I left the service, why I came here, why I built this club in this town." The coffee maker made a sound like a cough. The wind pressed against the walls. Dutch stood perfectly still, his scar a white line in the half-dark, his eyes locked on a man he'd trusted with his life for 2 decades, who was now telling him, without saying it directly, that everything he thought he knew about the Black Forge riders was about to change. "That kid," Mason said, "just kicked over a rock I've been standing on for 15 years. He reached for his jacket, worn leather, black, the Black Forge patch stitched on the back with thread that had been replaced so many times it was a different color than the original. He pulled it on, zipped it to the throat, walked toward the bay door and stood at the edge of the light, looking out into the fog where nothing was visible except the faint glow of a streetlight 3 blocks away. "Get everyone in here by morning, full table, no exceptions." Dutch didn't ask questions. He pulled out the flip phone again. And somewhere in the dark, a 12-year-old boy lay awake in a cold apartment, listening to the silence, not knowing that the question he'd been carrying for months, the question every adult in his life had told him to put down, had just detonated a truth that would either save his town or burn it to the ground. The wind shifted, the fog thickened, and the first engine turned over in the Black Forge garage, its growl rolling through the empty streets like a warning that nobody was awake to hear. Not yet. Claire Rowan arrived at the Black Forge compound at 11:47 p.m. on a Saturday night, driving a dented Subaru with a cracked windshield and a back seat buried under file boxes, fast food wrappers, and 3 years of professional ruin. She killed the engine in the gravel lot and sat there for a full minute, both hands on the steering wheel, staring at the row of Harleys under the overhang, like she was trying to decide if this was the worst decision she'd ever made or just the most recent in a long series. The bay door was open. Light spilled out in a yellow rectangle across the gravel. She could see shadows moving inside, but big shadows, the kind that belonged to men who didn't fold easily. The smell hit her before she reached the door. Engine oil, burnt coffee, the sour bite of cigarette smoke layered so thick it had become part of the walls. Dutch met her at the threshold. He didn't offer his hand. He looked at her the way a bouncer looks at a name on a list he didn't write. "Rowan." "Dutch, you look like hell." "That's because I've been living there." She pulled a canvas bag from her shoulder and stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. "Where's Mason?" The garage was different at night. The fluorescent lights buzzed louder when the world outside went quiet, and the motorcycles along the right wall threw shadows that made the room feel smaller, tighter, like the walls were leaning in to listen. 4 men sat around a makeshift table, 2 sawhorses with a sheet of plywood across them, scratched and stained with decades of use. Mason sat at the far end, his leather jacket hanging on the back of his chair, a thermal shirt stretched across shoulders that looked like they'd been built for carrying things that weren't meant to be carried alone. The young man with the tattoos, his name was Briggs, leaned against the wall behind Mason, his bad leg extended, his arms crossed. The bearded man, Gentry, sat to Mason's right, his taped hands resting flat on the plywood like he was ready to push the table over if the conversation went wrong. A 4th man Rowan hadn't met sat at the opposite end, older than the others, thin, with wire-rimmed glasses and a stillness about him that suggested he'd spent time in rooms where stillness was the difference between living and not. His vest said "Keeper" across the chest pocket. Mason didn't stand. He watched Rowan cross the garage the way he watched everything, with a patience that could be mistaken for indifference by anyone who didn't know better. "Sit down, Claire." She dropped the canvas bag on the table. It landed heavy. Papers shifted inside. "Don't call me Claire. You lost that when you stopped returning calls 2 years ago." Something moved behind Mason's eyes. Not guilt. Something older. He gestured at the empty chair to his left. She sat. "I stopped calling because I didn't have anything worth saying. And now?" Mason reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a phone. Not his, Eli's. He set it on the table, screen up, and pressed play. The video filled the silence. Everyone in the room had already seen it. They watched it again anyway. When it ended, Mason looked at Rowan and said nothing. She picked up the phone, replayed the last 30 seconds. The van cruising past the compound. Slow, deliberate. The cameras on the telephone poles visible in the frame. "Who's the kid?" 12 years old, rides a BMX. His mother volunteers at the outreach center. And he came here. To you. He came here because nobody else would listen. Rowan set the phone down. She rubbed her eyes with the heels of her hands, and when she dropped them, her face had changed. The journalist was in the room now. Not the woman who'd driven here in a car full of garbage and regret. The journalist. "Tell me everything." Dutch laid it out. The van schedule. The box counts Eli had tracked. The warehouse on Industrial Row. The route past the compound. The city cameras. The pattern. Every Tuesday, same time, same driver, same ghost volunteers who appeared and vanished. Rowan listened without interrupting, her fingers drumming a rhythm on the plywood that only she could hear. When Dutch finished, she opened her canvas bag and pulled out a laptop so old the brand logo had worn off the lid. She flipped it open, typed a password, and turned the screen toward the table. The Harlan County Community Outreach Center is a registered 501c3 under the umbrella of a parent organization called Bridgepoint Charitable Trust. She scrolled through a spreadsheet dense with numbers. Bridgepoint files public tax returns. Last year, they reported receiving $2.3 million in donated goods and cash grants for distribution across 14 community centers in 4 counties. But here's the thing. She clicked to a new tab. Only 6 of those 14 centers have physical addresses that check out. The other 8 are mail drops, P.O. boxes, a storage unit in Greenville, an empty lot on Route 9 that hasn't had a structure on it since the 90s. The room was quiet except for the hum of the lights and the distant sound of the wind finding gaps in the walls. Phantom centers, Gentry said. Phantom centers with real donation streams flowing into them and nothing coming out the other side. Rowan looked at Mason. Someone is siphoning goods on an industrial scale and laundering the paperwork through legitimate community programs. The outreach center where the kid's mom works is one of the real ones, which makes it perfect cover. Real families, real need, real volunteers, and a real loading dock where boxes disappear every Tuesday. Briggs shifted against the wall. His bad leg had started to ache. "So who runs Bridgepoint?" Rowan hesitated. It was a small hesitation, barely a breath. But in a room full of men trained to notice breathing, it was loud. The board of directors includes a city councilman named Hargrove, the county housing authority director, 2 local business owners, and the executive director is a woman named Patricia Calloway. "Mrs. Calloway," Dutch said. "From the center." From the center. She's not just running the front desk. She's the signature on every distribution report, every inventory audit, every tax filing. She's either the architect or the most useful puppet in Harlan County. Mason hadn't spoken since the video. He sat with his hands laced together on the table, his thumbs pressing against each other hard enough to whiten the knuckles. The photograph on the corkboard behind him was just visible over his shoulder. The young woman in the summer dress, the motorcycle that gleamed. "You said Hargrove," Mason said. His voice was low, controlled. The voice of a man holding something behind his teeth. "City councilman, 3rd District. Been in office 11 years. Sits on the zoning board, the Public Safety Committee, and the Charitable Allocations Commission, which is the body that approves grant funding for organizations like Bridgepoint." Rowan paused. "You know him." It wasn't a question. Mason's jaw tightened. The tendons in his neck stood out like cables. "Mason." Dutch's voice was careful. The voice you use near something that might break. "What's Hargrove got to do with why you left the service?" The coffee maker on the back counter was off. Nobody had made a fresh pot. The garage felt colder than it should have, even with the bay door closed now, even with 6 bodies generating heat. Keeper, the thin man with the glasses, sat perfectly still at the far end of the table, watching Mason the way a medic watches a wound. 15 years ago, Mason said, I was running supply logistics in Kandahar. Fuel, food, medical equipment, everything that kept a forward operating base alive. My unit handled distribution. We made sure the right things got to the right places. He unlaced his hands and laid them flat on the table. His fingers were scarred, old scars, pale and smooth, the kind that came from grabbing things that were too hot or too sharp. Someone above me was rerouting supplies, skimming. Medical kits that were supposed to reach field hospitals ended up in private warehouses. Fuel shipments got diverted. Food rations came up short at 3 different bases, while someone was selling surplus to contractors at markup. Nobody moved. I reported it, through channels, by the book. And the investigation went exactly nowhere because the officer running the operation had connections that went 3 ranks above my pay grade. Mason's voice didn't waver. It didn't rise. It stayed flat, steady, terrible. 2 men in my unit died because a medical resupply that was supposed to arrive on Tuesday never showed up. They bled out waiting for equipment that was sitting in a warehouse 60 miles away with someone else's name on it. The fluorescent light above the table flickered. In the half-second of darkness, every face in the room looked older. The officer's name was Colonel Richard Hargrove. Rowan's fingers stopped drumming. He retired with full honors, moved to Harlan County, got into local politics, built himself into a pillar of the community. Mason looked at the table, at his own hands, at the scars. I came here because I couldn't let it go. Built the club because I needed men around me who understood what it meant to watch someone steal from the people who needed it most and get away with it. But I never moved on Hargrove, never had enough, never had proof that would stick. So I sat here, fixed engines, watched him get reelected, watched him put his name on charity events and smile for cameras and shake hands with people whose kids were going hungry. He looked up. His eyes were dry in the way that desert is dry, not empty, but scorched. Everything burned away except what couldn't be destroyed. And now a 12-year-old kid on a bicycle just handed me what 15 years of silence couldn't produce. The wind hit the bay door hard enough to make it rattle in its tracks. Briggs pushed off the wall and limped to the coffee maker. He filled it with water, spooned grounds into the filter with hands that had a fine tremor, and hit the switch. The machine started its slow, grinding work. Nobody spoke until the first drops hit the pot. This changes things, Dutch said. This changes everything, Rowan corrected. Mason, if Hargrove is connected to Bridgepoint and Bridgepoint is running a fraud operation through community centers, we're not talking about a local corruption story. We're talking about a pattern, military supply theft, charitable fraud, a 15-year cover-up. This is federal. It's not going federal. Mason's voice had an edge now, a blade sliding out of its sheath. Federal means agents. Agents mean warrants. Warrants mean Hargrove's lawyers have 72 hours to shred everything in that warehouse before anyone with a badge gets within a mile of it. I've watched this man operate. He doesn't panic, he plans. And the first thing he'll plan is burning every piece of evidence that connects him to anything. Then what are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we do what that kid did. We collect, we document, we build something so heavy that when it drops, nobody can pick it up and throw it away. Gentry spoke for the first time in 10 minutes. His voice was gravel and smoke. And the frame job? The van driving past our cameras every Tuesday? That's still happening. Every week that goes by, they're building a case that we're the ones stealing from those families. One anonymous tip to the sheriff, and they raid this compound instead of that warehouse. I know. You know, and you want to sit here and collect documents. I want to sit here and collect documents. Gentry stared at Mason. The tape on his hands was wound so tight his fingertips were turning dark. Last time you told me to be patient, I spent 14 months in a stockade because the man I was supposed to trust sold our position to people who wanted us dead. You remember that? Every day. Then don't ask me to be patient. Ask me to be smart. There's a difference. Mason held Gentry's stare. The two men had known each other long enough that the argument wasn't really about patience or strategy. It was about trust, about whether Mason had earned enough of it to ask for more. The garage was so quiet, Eli could have heard it from 4 blocks away if he'd been listening. 2 weeks, Mason said. Give me 2 weeks. Rowan builds the paper trail. We monitor the warehouse. We document every delivery, every route, every face that walks in and out. If Hargrove moves first, we move faster. But we don't go loud until we have something that can't be denied, can't be buried, and can't be blamed on us. Gentry didn't nod. He didn't agree. He just unwound the tape from his right hand, rewound it, and looked away. In the language of the Black Forge, that was enough. Keeper spoke for the first time. His voice was soft, precise, completely out of place in a room full of scarred hands and engine grease. The boy, Eli. He's exposed. Everyone looked at him. He filmed the warehouse. He came here. If anyone on Hargrove's side is watching, and we should assume they are, the boy is a loose end. 12 years old, rides a bicycle through town, lives with a single mother in an apartment building with no security. He's not protected. The words landed in the room like stones dropped into still water. Ripples moved through every man at the table. Briggs stopped pouring coffee. Dutch's hand went to the edge of the plywood and gripped it. Gentry looked at Mason with an expression that said, "I told you so," without opening his mouth. Mason stood up. The chair scraped against the concrete floor. He walked to the corkboard and stood in front of it, his back to the room, his shoulders a wall of tension beneath the thermal shirt. He reached up and touched the photograph again. The woman, the summer dress, the gleaming motorcycle. His thumb traced the edge of the print. When he spoke, his voice came from a place so deep it barely had sound. "Briggs, you and Dutch take shifts. I want eyes on that apartment building from 6 a.m. to midnight. You don't approach. You don't engage. You sit in a car 3 blocks away, and you watch. And if someone comes for the kid..." Mason turned around. Whatever had been behind his eyes when he touched the photograph was gone now. What replaced it was something Eli would have recognized if he'd been standing in the room. The same flat, unreadable calm from the gate. The calm of a man who'd already decided what he was willing to do and was no longer negotiating with himself about it. "Then you call me." Rowan closed her laptop. She looked at the men around the table, scarred, exhausted, carrying damage that didn't show on insurance forms or disability claims. Wounded veterans playing protector for a child they barely knew, in a town that feared them, against an enemy who wore suits and sat on city councils and smiled for newspapers. She'd spent 3 years in professional exile after a story she'd published about municipal fraud had been discredited by sources who turned out to be plants. She'd lost her job, her apartment, her credibility, and most of her belief that the truth could survive contact with people who had enough money to reshape it. And now she was sitting in a motorcycle garage at midnight, watching a man with scars on his hands and ghosts in his eyes ask his brothers to stand guard over a 12-year-old boy. She wanted to say something. She didn't know what. So she packed her laptop into the canvas bag and stood up. "I'll start with the tax filings. Bridgepoint's 9902s are public record. If the Phantom Centers are listed as active distribution points, there will be inventory discrepancies I can cross-reference against county health department inspection logs. If those centers never received inspections, the whole reporting structure collapses." Mason nodded. I'll need access to your security footage. The camera's facing the street every Tuesday for the past 6 months. Keeper handles the system. He'll get you what you need. Keeper adjusted his glasses and produced a flash drive from his vest pocket as if he'd been expecting the request for hours. He held it out to Rowan. She took it. Their fingers didn't touch. One more thing. Rowan slung the bag over her shoulder. The kid's mother, Nina. She volunteers at the center. She signs families in. If Calloway is involved, Nina might have seen things she doesn't know she's seen. Shift schedules, inventory sheets, faces. She's a witness, and she doesn't know it. She's also the reason the kid hasn't told anyone else, Mason said. She needs that volunteer position. She's applying for a county job. If we pull her in, we put her livelihood at risk. If we don't pull her in, we put her kid at risk. The sentence hung in the air like cigarette smoke, visible, acrid, impossible to wave away. Mason and Rowan looked at each other across the plywood table, and for a moment the 15 years between them collapsed into nothing. Two people who'd spent too long watching the wrong people win, standing in a cold garage, arguing about which kind of damage was more survivable. I'll talk to her, Mason said. Not you, me. She doesn't know you. She knows what this club is, or what she thinks it is. That's enough to start. Rowan shook her head but didn't argue. She walked toward the bay door, then stopped. Turned back. Mason, the warehouse on Industrial Row. You said you know who owns it. The garage went still. Dutch looked at the floor. Briggs looked at the ceiling. Gentry looked at Mason with the expression of a man watching a grenade pin being pulled. I said that. Who? Mason exhaled. It was a long exhale, the kind that carries weight out of the body and leaves nothing behind but the frame. The property is held by a shell company called Ridgeline Holdings, LLC. Ridgeline is registered in Delaware. The registered agent is a law firm in Wilmington that handles incorporations for people who don't want their names on buildings. He paused. I've been paying Keeper to run that property record once a year for the last decade. The ownership hasn't changed. Mason. Who? The sole member of Ridgeline Holdings is listed under a trust. The trustee is a retired military officer with an address in Harlan County. Hargrove. Hargrove owns the warehouse. Hargrove sits on the board of Bridgepoint. Hargrove approves the grant funding that feeds the operation. And Hargrove's van drives past my compound every Tuesday to make sure that when this whole thing blows, the shrapnel lands on us. Rowan stood in the bay door, the fog pressing against her back, the fluorescent light turning her face into sharp angles and deep shadows. She looked like a woman standing on the edge of a roof, deciding not whether to jump, but where to land. 2 weeks isn't enough, she said, but it's what we've got. She walked into the fog. Her car started. The headlights swept across the gravel and disappeared. Mason sat back down at the table. The coffee Briggs had made was already going cold. The flash drive was gone with Rowan. The phone with Eli's footage sat in the center of the plywood like an unexploded ordnance. Keeper. Yeah. Pull everything you have on Bridgepoint. Every filing, every board meeting minute, every inspection report. I want it organized by date and cross-referenced with the van schedule by Monday. Keeper nodded and left through the side door without a sound, the way he always moved, like a man who'd learned that being noticed was the most dangerous thing a person could be. Gentry. Gentry looked at him. You're right. I am asking you to be patient, and I know what it cost you last time. Mason leaned forward. But that kid walked in here because he believed someone in this building would do the right thing. If we move too fast and Hargrove buries the evidence, that kid goes back to watching boxes disappear every Tuesday and knowing that nobody, not even us, could stop it. I won't do that to him. Gentry's jaw worked. The muscles in his forearms tightened beneath the tape. He looked at Mason for a long time. Then he stood up, put his chair back against the wall, and walked toward the bay door. 2 weeks, he said without turning around. Not a day more. The door closed behind him. The garage settled into its midnight silence. The tick of cooling engines, the hum of lights, the distant moan of wind finding its way through Industrial Row toward a warehouse full of stolen food and a secret that had been 15 years in the making. Mason sat alone at the table. He picked up Eli's phone and looked at the black screen. His own reflection stared back at him. A man with steel gray hair and eyes that held too much and showed too little. He set the phone down. He pressed both palms flat against the plywood surface and closed his eyes. When he opened them, he reached for his jacket, pulled it on, walked to the bay door and pushed it open. The fog was so thick the Harleys under the overhang were barely visible. The gravel lot looked like it ended 3 feet from the door, like the world beyond had been erased. His phone buzzed. A text from Dutch, already in position. Kid's apartment dark. All quiet. Mason typed back, "Stay until I send relief at 6. He stood there in the doorway, the cold pressing against him, the fog swallowing everything beyond the fence. Somewhere in this town, a city councilman was sleeping in a warm house with locked doors and clean hands, and the absolute certainty that no one would ever connect the dots between a warehouse on Industrial Row and a career built on stolen supplies and forged charity reports. And somewhere else, on the 3rd floor of a building with a broken water heater and a space heater that hummed like a prayer nobody was saying, a 12-year-old boy was dreaming about boxes that disappeared and a question that wouldn't let him go. Mason zipped his jacket to the throat, pulled the bay door shut, walked to his motorcycle. A black Softail with no chrome, no polish, nothing that caught light, and sat on it without starting the engine. He gripped the handlebars and felt the cold metal through his gloves and breathed the fog into his lungs and held it there. 2 weeks. 14 days to build a case that could survive a man who'd spent 15 years making evidence vanish. 14 days with a 12-year-old kid exposed, a journalist running on fumes and fury, a brotherhood held together by scars and stubbornness, and a secret sitting in Mason's chest like a second heartbeat that he'd never told anyone. Not Dutch, not Gentry, not Keeper, not a single soul in this club. The woman in the photograph. The summer dress. The motorcycle that gleamed. She'd been the one who first found the discrepancies in Kandahar. She'd been the one who brought them to Mason. And when the investigation went nowhere and the 2 men died waiting for supplies that never came, she'd been the one who said she'd go public on her own. She disappeared 3 weeks later. The military listed her as a non-combat casualty. Administrative closure. No investigation. No explanation. No body recovered. Her name was Sarah, and she was the reason Mason Creed had spent 15 years in Harlan County, fixing engines and watching Richard Hargrove smile for cameras, waiting for the moment when the weight of what he'd done would finally be too heavy to carry. A 12-year-old boy on a broken bicycle had just become that moment. Mason started the engine. The Softail growled to life, low and deep, a sound that traveled through the fog like something alive. He didn't ride anywhere. He sat there in the gravel lot with the engine running, the vibration moving through his hands and arms and chest, and he let it hold him the way nothing else could. The fog pressed in. The town slept. And beneath the surface of Harlan County, in warehouses and filing cabinets and the locked offices of men who believed their secrets were buried deep enough to never be found, something had already begun to shift, a fault line cracking open in the dark, silent and irreversible, waiting for the first tremor to bring everything down. The call came at 4:11 a.m. on the 9th day. Dutch's voice on the line was the kind of quiet that only happens when something has already gone wrong. Not panicked, not rushed. The flat, measured tone of a man delivering information he wishes he didn't have. Someone hit Rowan's car. Mason was already standing. He'd been sitting on the edge of his bed in the room behind the garage, a space barely larger than a cell, a military cot, a footlocker, a lamp with no shade, fully dressed, boots laced, like he'd been waiting. He pulled the phone tighter against his ear. Where? Her apartment complex. Parking lot. All 4 tires slashed. Windshield smashed in. They poured something on the seats. Bleach, maybe. The whole interior is destroyed. Dutch paused. And they left something on the hood. What? A photograph. Eli. Taken from across the street. Recent. He's on his bicycle. You can see Nina's apartment building in the background. Mason's hand found the doorframe. His knuckles went white against the wood. The lamp threw his shadow long and crooked against the cinder block wall, and for a moment he didn't move, didn't breathe, just stood there like a man absorbing a bullet before the pain arrives. Rowan? She's here. She's fine. Shaken up. Won't admit it. The kid? Briggs is on him. Apartment's dark. No movement. Mason grabbed his jacket from the hook by the door. The leather was cold. It always was. He zipped it, pocketed the phone, and walked through the garage toward the bay door, his boots marking a steady rhythm on the concrete floor, passing the silent row of motorcycles, the workbenches, the corkboard with the photograph he touched every night before turning off the lights. He didn't touch it now. He pushed the bay door open and stepped into the pre-dawn dark. Rowan was sitting on the curb outside the compound gate, her canvas bag on the ground beside her, her arms wrapped around her knees. She was wearing a man's flannel shirt over a t-shirt, no jacket, and the cold had turned her knuckles red and her lips pale. Dutch stood 3 feet behind her, his scar catching what little light came from the single bulb above the gate. Mason walked to the curb and stood over her. She didn't look up. "How'd they find you?" "How do you think?" Her voice was raw, scraped, like she'd been screaming or crying or both and had stopped just before they arrived. "I've been pulling public records from the county clerk's office for 8 days, filing FOIA requests, calling the state charity commission, asking questions about Bridgepoint in rooms where Bridgepoint has friends." She finally looked up. Her eyes were wet, but her jaw was set, and the combination made her look like someone standing in a burning building trying to decide which window to jump from. "I wasn't careful enough." "I know. Save it." "I wasn't going to say that." "Then what?" Mason crouched down. The gravel crunched under his boots. His face was level with hers now, and in the dim light his eyes had the color of old iron. Not warm, not cold, just heavy. "Did you back up everything?" She stared at him. Then she reached into the canvas bag and pulled out a flash drive and a sealed envelope thick with paper. 3 copies. 1 on the drive. 1 printed. 1 uploaded to a secure server that only I can access. She almost smiled. It didn't reach her eyes. "I'm not a rookie, Mason. I lost my career because I trusted the wrong source, not because I forgot to save my work." He took the flash drive and the envelope, stood up, looked at Dutch. "Get her inside. Coffee, blankets, whatever she needs." He turned back to Rowan. "You're staying here tonight." "I don't need... You're staying here tonight." The way he said it closed the conversation like a door being locked. Rowan looked at him for a long moment, then picked up her bag and followed Dutch through the gate. Mason stood on the curb alone, holding the flash drive in his left hand and the envelope in his right, and looked down the empty street toward the fog that was already building in the low places between buildings. Somebody had escalated. Somebody had moved from the slow, patient work of building a frame to direct intimidation. And they'd used a photograph of a 12-year-old boy to do it. Mason put the flash drive in his jacket pocket and walked back inside. By 6 a.m., the table in the garage was covered. Rowan's printed documents spread across the plywood in rows that Keeper had organized with the precision of a man who'd spent years arranging intelligence briefings in rooms with no windows, tax filings on the left, property records in the center, delivery logs, reconstructed from Eli's observations and the club's security footage, on the right. Bank statements Rowan had obtained through a source she refused to name ran along the bottom edge like a border. Everyone was there. Mason at the head, Dutch to his left, Gentry to his right, the tape on his hands fresh, wound so tight his fingers barely flexed. Briggs leaned against the wall, a cup of coffee cooling in his damaged hand, his eyes jumping between the documents and the bay door like he expected someone to come through it. Keeper sat at the far end, his glasses reflecting the fluorescent light, a legal pad in front of him covered in handwriting so small it looked like code. Rowan stood. She'd accepted the coffee, but not the blanket. She planted both hands on the table and leaned forward, and when she spoke, her voice had the cadence of someone presenting closing arguments to a jury that didn't want to listen. "Here's what we have. Bridgepoint Charitable Trust has been operating a diversion scheme for at least 3 years, probably longer. Donated goods, food, clothing, medical supplies enter the system through legitimate community centers. They're logged, inventoried, and assigned to distribution routes. But somewhere between the loading dock and the destination, a significant percentage of those goods is rerouted to a network of warehouses controlled by shell companies. The goods are then resold through secondary markets, discount stores, flea markets, online liquidation platforms. The revenue flows back through the shell companies into accounts that ultimately connect to Bridgepoint's board members. She flipped a page. The warehouse on Industrial Row is one of at least 4 storage facilities in the network. Keeper's property records confirm that all 4 are held by entities traceable to Ridgeline Holdings, which is Hargrove's shell company. The delivery routes are designed to pass through areas associated with the Black Forge riders, creating a visual trail that would support a cover story if anyone started asking questions. Gentry leaned back in his chair. The wood creaked under his weight. How much? Conservative estimate? Based on the filings and the volume of goods moving through the system? Rowan looked at her notes. Over the last 3 years, between $4 and $6 million in donated goods have been diverted. That's food and supplies that were supposed to reach families in 4 counties. The number sat in the room like a physical object, heavy, dense, taking up space that nobody could move around. $4 million, Briggs said quietly, stolen from people who don't have enough to eat. Stolen from people who are standing in line at the outreach center right now, Rowan said, waiting for a bag of groceries that's half the size it should be because 43 boxes went out the back door on Tuesday. Mason hadn't spoken. He sat with the flash drive in front of him, his hands flat on the table, his eyes moving across the documents like a man reading a map of a territory he'd always known existed, but had never seen drawn out. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low the men closest to him leaned in to hear. You said the revenue connects to board members, plural. Plural. Rowan pulled a single sheet from the bottom of the stack. This is where it gets complicated. The financial trail doesn't just lead to Hargrove, it leads to 6 people on the Bridgepoint board, 2 county officials who signed off on fraudulent inspection reports, and she set the paper down and pressed her finger against a name circled in red ink. The chief of staff to the state senator who chairs the appropriations committee that funds community outreach programs across the state. Dutch exhaled through his teeth, a long, low sound. That's not local corruption, that's an infrastructure. Rowan straightened up. This isn't a city councilman skimming donations in one county. This is a system, built over years, protected by people at every level who either benefit directly or look the other way, because the people who benefit make it worth their while. The garage was silent except for the fluorescent lights, which seemed louder now, their buzz filling the spaces between thoughts. Gentry unwound the tape from his left hand, rewound it, and pulled it tight enough to make the veins in his forearm stand out. You're telling us, Gentry said, his voice the low rasp of stone against stone, that we're not just going after Hargrove. We're going after a network that includes people with the power to bury us, legally, publicly, permanently. Yes. And we're sitting in a garage with 6 men and a journalist who already lost her career once. 7. Everyone turned. Keeper had spoken without looking up from his legal pad. There are 7 of us. You keep forgetting to count me. Well, nobody laughed, but the tension in the room shifted, loosened a fraction, like a bolt that turns just enough to let pressure escape without everything coming apart. Mason stood up. He walked to the corkboard. His hand went to the photograph. Sarah, the summer dress, the motorcycle. His thumb rested on the bottom edge of the print. He stood there for 4 seconds, 5, 6. Then he turned around, and what was in his face made Briggs set his coffee down and stand straighter against the wall. There's something I haven't told you. Mason's voice carried no inflection, no emotion. The voice of a man about to detonate something he'd been carrying for years. I said Sarah found the discrepancies in Kandahar. I said she wanted to go public. I said she disappeared and the military closed the file. He paused, swallowed. The sound was audible in the silent room. What I didn't tell you is that before she disappeared, she sent me a package, a physical package, mailed through civilian channels to a P.O. box I kept in Virginia. Inside was a ledger, handwritten. Dates, amounts, names, routing numbers, everything she'd collected. And a letter. Dutch's hands had gone still at his sides. His scar looked whiter than usual against skin that had gone pale. The letter said she'd confronted Hargrove. Directly. In his office. She told him she had the ledger and she was going to the Inspector General. She said Hargrove was calm, didn't threaten her, just smiled and said she should be careful because Kandahar was a dangerous place and accidents happened all the time. Mason's jaw tightened until the muscles in his cheeks stood out like fists beneath the skin. 3 weeks later, she was gone. Rowan's hand was pressed flat against the table, fingers spread, as if she was trying to hold herself upright. You've had a ledger connecting Hargrove to military supply theft for 15 years. Yes. And you never used it. I couldn't prove where it came from. Sarah was listed as a non-combat casualty. Her personal effects were cataloged and returned to her family. But the ledger wasn't in them because she'd mailed it to me. If I came forward with a handwritten ledger from a dead woman whose death was never investigated, with no chain of custody, no corroborating witness, and accusations against a decorated colonel with political connections, Mason shook his head. They would have called me a disgruntled veteran with a grudge. They would have discredited the ledger, and they would have destroyed any future chance of holding Hargrove accountable. So you waited. I built a club. I surrounded myself with men who'd been burned by the same kind of people, and I waited for something I could use alongside the ledger. Something current, something provable, something that would show Hargrove hadn't stopped, that the same man who stole medical supplies from soldiers was now stealing food from children. Mason looked at the table covered in documents. Rowan, what you've built in 9 days is the corroboration I've been waiting for since Sarah died. The word died landed in the room like a body hitting the floor. Not disappeared, not was lost, died. Mason had never said it out loud before. The acknowledgement changed the air in the garage, charged it, thickened it, turned the cigarette smoke and coffee steam and fluorescent buzz into something that pressed against the skin. Gentry stood up. His chair scraped against concrete. He walked toward Mason and stopped 3 feet away, close enough that both men could see every line and scar on the other's face. You sat on this. Gentry's voice was barely above a whisper, which made it more dangerous than shouting. You sat on this for 15 years. You let us follow you. You let us build this club around you. And the entire time, the reason we were here, the reason you recruited every man in this room, was because you were building a case against one man, for one woman. Mason didn't flinch. Yes, you used us. I protected you, from the same man who destroyed her. You don't get to decide what protection looks like, Mason, not without telling us what we're being protected from. Gentry's taped hands were shaking, not from cold, not from anger, from the particular kind of betrayal that comes from a man you trusted telling you the truth years too late. I sat in a stockade for 14 months because of a command failure in Kandahar. Was that connected to Hargrove? The question filled the space between them like a wall. Mason's eyes held Gentry's and didn't move. The supply diversion that caused the shortage at your base was part of the same operation Sarah documented. Your unit's request for resupply was delayed because the materials had already been rerouted. The stockade charge against you was based on a report filed by an officer in Hargrove's chain of command. Gentry's face didn't change. It locked. Every muscle, every line, every pore went rigid, like stone setting. He stood there for 5 full seconds, breathing through his nose in short, controlled bursts that said more about what was happening inside him than any word could have. Then he turned and walked out of the garage. Nobody followed him. Nobody tried. In the language of the Black Forge, a man walking out was a man who needed distance, not company. The bay door opened, cold air flooded in, and Gentry's silhouette disappeared into the gray morning light. Dutch let the silence hold for 10 seconds. Then, "He'll come back." "Maybe," Mason said. "Maybe not. Either way, he deserved the truth." "We all did." Mason looked at Dutch. The two men had known each other for 22 years, and in that time they'd built something that wasn't friendship exactly. It was deeper than that and uglier, held together by shared damage and the unspoken agreement that neither of them would ever have to explain themselves to the other. Dutch was telling Mason, without raising his voice, that the agreement had just been violated. "I know," Mason said. "Do you?" "Yes." Dutch held his stare for another 3 seconds. Then he picked up his coffee, took a sip of something that had gone cold long ago, and set it back down. "Then what happens now?" Rowan answered. She'd been standing motionless during the confrontation, her eyes moving between the men like someone watching a structure develop cracks in real time. Now she stepped forward and pulled a folded newspaper from her canvas bag. She dropped it on the table. The front page of the Harlan County Register, dated that morning. The headline read, "County officials announce surprise inspection of local motorcycle club compound." Below it, a photograph of the Black Forge Gate. Below that, a quote from City Councilman Richard Hargrove. Recent reports of suspicious activity in the Industrial Row corridor have raised concerns about the safety of our community. We owe it to the families of Harlan County to ensure that all organizations operating within our borders are held to the highest standards of accountability. Mason picked up the newspaper. "Read it," set it down. "He's moving," Briggs said from the wall. "He's been moving," Keeper said quietly. The car attack on Rowan, the photograph of the boy, and now this. 3 escalations in 72 hours. He knows we're collecting evidence. He's not trying to hide anymore. He's trying to end this before we can use what we have. "The inspection is scheduled for Monday," Rowan said. 3 days. They'll come in with county code enforcement, fire marshals, building inspectors. They'll find violations. They always do in a building this old. They'll issue citations, maybe a cease and desist, maybe a condemnation order. The goal isn't to find anything criminal. The goal is to shut this compound down and scatter everyone inside it. Mason looked at the table, at the documents, at the flash drive, at the newspaper with Hargrove's name in print, smiling out of the page with the polished confidence of a man who'd spent 15 years turning corruption into respectability. "We have 3 days. Less," Keeper said. "If they're watching the compound and the photograph of the boy proves they know who's been here, they'll expect us to move evidence before the inspection, which means they'll be looking for exactly that. Any attempt to remove documents or equipment will be photographed, logged, and used against us." "Then we don't remove anything." Everyone looked at Mason. "We don't hide. We don't run. We don't move a single piece of paper out of this building." He reached across the table and picked up the flash drive, held it between his thumb and forefinger. "Rowan, how fast can you build a presentation? Not a legal filing, not a report, something visual, something a room full of people who've never read a tax document in their lives can understand in 20 minutes. Rowan's eyes narrowed. "What kind of room?" "This room, the garage. Open the bay doors, set up a screen, invite every family that walks through the outreach center's front door, every volunteer, every person in this town who's been told there aren't enough donations to go around." Briggs pushed off the wall. "You want to hold a public gathering. Here, in the compound they're about to inspect. I want to hold a community event. Open doors. Nothing to hide. Bring your kids. Bring your neighbors. Come see who the Black Forge riders really are and what's really been happening to the food your families were supposed to receive." "That's insane," Dutch said. "That's the only move we have." Mason set the flash drive down. "Hargrove's play is to shut us down before the evidence goes public. His advantage is control. He controls the inspection timeline, the media narrative, the political machinery. The one thing he can't control is a room full of people looking at proof. If we hold a public event before the inspection, with the evidence on display in front of witnesses on camera, he can't bury it. He can't spin it. He can't blame us for something that 100 people just watched us expose." Keeper adjusted his glasses. "Saturday. The inspection is Monday. If we hold the event Saturday afternoon, we have 48 hours of public awareness before anyone with a badge walks through that gate. That's enough time for the story to spread. Phone cameras, social media, local press." "Rowan?" She was already pulling out her laptop. "I can build it, the footage, the documents, the financial trail, the shell companies, the phantom centers, all of it. But Mason, the ledger, Sarah's ledger, does it go in?" The garage went quiet again. The name Sarah moved through the room like a draft through a cracked window. Mason looked at the corkboard, at the photograph, at the woman who'd been brave enough to confront the man who killed her and smart enough to send the proof to someone she trusted before they could destroy it. "It goes in," he said. "All of it." Dutch's phone buzzed. He pulled it out, read the screen, and his face changed. Not dramatically. A tightening around the eyes. A shift in his breathing. The kind of change that only someone who'd spent decades reading men in danger would notice. Mason. What? Briggs just texted from the kid's apartment. Dutch looked up from the phone. Nina's not home. She left for work at the dry cleaner at 6 this morning, but she didn't arrive. Her car is still in the parking lot. Her purse is on the front seat. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Eli Mercer had never heard. 4 blocks away, asleep in his cold apartment, he didn't know that his mother had walked out the door 2 hours ago and vanished between the parking lot and the street. He didn't know that her car sat in its usual spot with the doors unlocked and her wallet visible through the window. He didn't know that the man who had promised to protect him was standing in a garage surrounded by men with scars and ghosts and a 15-year-old ledger written by a dead woman staring at a phone screen with an expression that looked like a man watching the ground open beneath his feet. Mason set both hands on the table, pressed down hard enough to bend the plywood. His knuckles were white. His arms were rigid. His eyes were fixed on a point somewhere below the surface of the wood, somewhere past the documents and the flash drive and the newspaper with Hargrove's face. Somewhere in the dark space where the thing he'd been afraid of since the moment Eli walked through the gate had finally arrived. They had Nina, or she was running, or she was lying in a ditch on the road between her apartment and the dry cleaner. The possibilities spread out in front of him like roads through a minefield, and every single one of them led to the same place. A 12-year-old boy waking up to an empty apartment, reaching for a mother who wasn't there, and learning the lesson that Mason had spent his entire adult life trying to unlearn, that the people who are supposed to protect you are the first ones to disappear. "Find her," Mason said. The words came out broken. Not loud, not commanding. Broken, the way glass breaks, sudden, sharp, impossible to put back together. "Find her now." The Dutch was already dialing. Briggs was already moving. Keeper was already pulling security feeds. The garage erupted into controlled chaos, boots on concrete, phones buzzing, engines being wheeled out of the way to clear space, Gentry's absence a visible hole in the formation that nobody mentioned but everyone felt. And Mason stood at the head of the table, surrounded by the evidence of 15 years of patience, and realized that patience had just run out. Hargrove wasn't building a frame anymore. He wasn't playing defense. He was cutting pieces off the board. Rowan's car, the photograph, the newspaper, and now Nina, the mother of the only witness, the woman whose signature was on every intake form at the outreach center, the person who could confirm from the inside what the documents proved from the outside. The bay door opened. Cold air rushed in. The morning light was gray and flat, the kind of light that made everything look like a photograph taken after the world had ended. Mason walked to the threshold and stood there, looking out at the empty gravel lot, the chain-link fence, the street beyond where a delivery van would drive past on Tuesday like it always did, slow and deliberate, building a lie one trip at a time. Except Tuesday wasn't coming. Not this time. Not ever again. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in 11 years. It rang 4 times. A voice answered. Older than he remembered, tired. The voice of a man who'd been carrying weight he didn't choose. "It's Creed." Silence on the other end, then, "I wondered when you'd call. I need you in Harlan County, tonight." What happened? Mason looked at the fog, at the street, at the world that was about to change. "Hargrove took a mother from her kid, and I'm done waiting." He hung up, pocketed the phone. He stood in the doorway of the Black Forge garage with the cold pressing against his face, and the sound of his brothers mobilizing behind him, and the weight of 15 years of silence finally, irreversibly, breaking apart inside his chest. 3 days until the inspection, 2 days until Saturday, 1 missing mother, 1 sleeping child, and a secret that had just outgrown every wall Mason had built to contain it. The engines started, one by one, low, deep, rolling through the fog like thunder from underground. The sound carried down the empty streets of Harlan County, past the boarded-up stores and the broken streetlights, and the warehouse on Industrial Row where 43 boxes of stolen food sat in the dark, waiting for someone who would never come to collect them. The Black Forge was riding. Not to fight. Not yet. To find a woman who'd disappeared between her front door and the morning light, in a town where disappearing was starting to feel like a pattern that no one, not anymore, not after today, was willing to accept. They found Nina at 9:23 a.m. in a storage unit off Route 12, 6 miles outside of town. Briggs spotted the door first, a rusted roll-up on Unit 14C at a self-storage facility that hadn't had an attendant on site in 3 years. The lock was new, bright brass against corroded metal. He called it in, and Dutch arrived 4 minutes later on foot, having parked his truck behind an abandoned feed store 200 yards down the road. They stood on either side of the door, listening. Nothing from inside. No sound, no movement. Just the wind pulling through the gaps in the corrugated walls and the distant hum of the highway. Dutch looked at Briggs. Briggs nodded. Dutch pulled bolt cutters from inside his jacket, the short-handled kind that fit under a vest, and snapped the lock in one motion. The brass fell into the gravel. The sound was small and final. They rolled the door up. The smell hit them first, chemical, sharp, the same bleach that had been poured in Rowan's car. Nina was sitting on a metal folding chair in the center of the unit, her wrists zip-tied behind her back, a strip of duct tape across her mouth. Her eyes were open, wide, red-rimmed. She was shaking, not the dramatic trembling of movies, but the deep involuntary shudder of a body that had been cold and terrified for 3 hours and had used up everything it had. Briggs cut the zip ties. Dutch pulled the tape. Nina gasped, a sound that came from somewhere below her lungs, from the place where the body stores the things the mind refuses to process. She tried to stand and her legs buckled. Briggs caught her. His bad legs screamed under the sudden weight, but he held her upright and didn't let go. "You're okay," he said. "You're okay. We've got you." She was crying, not loudly. The quiet, stuttering kind of crying that happens when someone has been alone in the dark long enough to believe that nobody was coming. Her hands were purple from the zip ties. Her coat was gone. She was wearing the same clothes she'd put on for work that morning. A thin sweater, slacks, shoes that weren't meant for standing in an unheated storage unit in November. Dutch called Mason. "We have her. Route 12, self-storage. She's alive. Needs a hospital." "No hospital." Mason's voice was immediate, hard. "They'll file a report. Report goes to the sheriff. Sheriff's department has 3 deputies who owe Hargrove favors. Bring her here." "Mason, she's—" "Bring her here. Keeper has medical training. Bring her here now." Dutch looked at Nina, at her purple hands, at her red eyes, at the chair she'd been tied to, at the empty storage unit with its bleach-stained floor and the new lock that someone had bought specifically for this purpose. He looked at all of it and swallowed the argument he wanted to make because Mason was right, and he hated that Mason was right. "We're moving," he said into the phone. They put Nina in Dutch's truck. Briggs sat in the back with her, his arm around her shoulders, his bad leg folded at an angle that was going to cost him later. She didn't speak during the drive. She stared at her hands, at the deep red grooves the zip ties had left around her wrists, and pressed them together in her lap like she was trying to hold something that wasn't there. When they pulled into the Black Forge compound, Mason was waiting at the gate. He opened the truck door himself, looked at Nina, looked at her wrists, looked at her face. Something moved behind his eyes. Not the iron calm he showed the world, but something raw, something that lived underneath it, something that had been born in Kandahar when Sarah's letter arrived and a woman's handwriting told him she was about to do something brave and he was too far away to stop it. "Nina, my name is Mason Creed. Your son came to me 9 days ago because he trusted us. I need you to trust us now." She looked at him, at his scarred hands, at his leather jacket, at the compound behind him, the cinder block walls, the motorcycles, the oil-stained garage that smelled like everything she'd been told to fear. "Where's Eli?" "At school. He doesn't know. Briggs will pick him up at 2:30 and bring him here." "Don't—" She grabbed Mason's arm. Her grip was weak, but her eyes were not. "Don't you dare let my son come here. Don't bring him into this. He's already in it, Nina. He's been in it since the first time he followed that van." She let go of his arm. Her hand fell to her side. And the sound she made, not a word, not a cry, just a low, broken exhalation, was the sound of a mother realizing that the thing she'd been trying to protect her son from was the same thing her son had been trying to protect her from, and neither of them had succeeded. Keeper met them inside. He'd cleared the workbench along the left wall and laid out a first aid kit, a blood pressure cuff he'd taken from a military surplus store 6 years ago, and a thermos of hot water. He checked Nina's wrists, cleaned the abrasions with antiseptic that made her hiss through her teeth, and wrapped them in gauze with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done field medicine in places where the nearest hospital was a helicopter ride and a prayer away. "Blood pressure's low but stable," he told Mason quietly. "Dehydration, mild hypothermia. She needs warmth, fluids, and sleep. She doesn't need a hospital, but she needs to not be sitting in a garage." Mason nodded. He led Nina to the room behind the garage. His room, the cot, the footlocker, the lamp with no shade. He gave her a wool blanket, a bottle of water, and a space heater he pulled from under the workbench. "Lock the door if you want," he said. "Nobody comes in unless you open it." She sat on the cot, pulled the blanket around her shoulders, looked up at him with eyes that were starting to clear, the shock receding like floodwater, leaving behind something harder and colder and more dangerous than fear. "They came to my car," she said. Her voice was flat, steady. The voice of a woman who had decided to stop being afraid and start being angry. "Two men. I didn't see their faces. They put something over my head, drove me to the storage unit, didn't say a word the entire time. When they took the hood off and I was in the chair, one of them leaned down and said 3 words. Mason waited. "Stop the boy." She said it without blinking, without trembling. She said it the way you'd read a death sentence that had already been carried out. Mason left the room, closed the door, stood in the hallway between the garage and the room with his back against the wall and his eyes closed and his hands pressed flat against the cinder block on either side of him, and he stayed there for a full minute, breathing. The cold of the wall seeped through his shirt and into his spine, and he let it. He needed it. He needed something solid against his back because the ground under his feet was dissolving. When he walked back into the garage, Gentry was there, standing by the table, arms crossed, tape on his hands, face unreadable. He'd been gone for 6 hours. He didn't explain where he'd been. He didn't apologize for leaving. He looked at Mason and said one thing. "What do you need?" Mason stopped. The two men faced each other across 5 feet of oil-stained concrete, and the air between them held everything that had been said and unsaid in the hours since Gentry had walked out. The betrayal, the anger, the 15 years of secrets, the stockade, the dead woman, the ledger, all of it. And on top of all of it, sitting like a stone on a pile of broken glass, was the fact that Gentry was here, standing in the garage, asking what was needed. Because whatever Mason had done, whatever he'd hidden, whatever trust he'd damaged, the Black Forge was still the only family Gentry had. And a family doesn't walk away when someone's mother is zip-tied to a chair in a storage unit. "Saturday," Mason said. "We go Saturday. Community gathering, open doors, everything on the table, everything on the screen. Rowan builds the presentation. Keeper handles logistics. You and Dutch handle security." "Security against what?" "Against whoever Hargrove sends when he finds out what we're doing." Gentry uncrossed his arms. "He's going to find out. He's going to find out because I'm going to tell him." The garage went still. Dutch, who'd been leaning against the bay door, straightened up. Briggs, who'd been icing his knee on the old couch, set the ice pack down. Keeper looked up from his legal pad. Rowan, sitting cross-legged on the floor with her laptop balanced on a toolbox, stopped typing. "You're going to tell Hargrove," Dutch repeated. "I'm going to walk into his office. I'm going to sit across from him. And I'm going to tell him that on Saturday afternoon, the Black Forge Riders are holding an open community event at our compound, and we'd like to invite the city council to attend." That's the move. If I invite him publicly, he has 2 choices. Show up and watch his world collapse in real time. Or don't show up and let 100 people watch the evidence without his version of events in the room. Either way, the information goes public. Either way, the story breaks. But if I invite him face to face, I get to see his eyes. I get to see if the man who smiled when he told Sarah that Kandahar was dangerous can still smile when he's looking at me. Dutch rubbed his face with both hands. When he dropped them, his expression was the look of a man who has followed another man into enough bad situations to know that this one will be worse and has already decided to go anyway. When? Now. Mason didn't change clothes, didn't clean up, didn't rehearse. He pulled on his leather jacket, the black forge patch visible on the back, the thread that had been replaced so many times it was 3 different colors, and walked out of the garage into the late morning light. The fog had burned off. The sky was white. The air was cold enough to make his breath visible in sharp, brief clouds that dissolved before they rose above his head. He rode the Softail into downtown Harlan County, past the outreach center where the fluorescent lights were still dying, past the library where Eli had searched for satellite locations that didn't exist, past the courthouse with its limestone columns and its flag that snapped in the wind like it was trying to get someone's attention. He parked on the street in front of the city council offices, a 2-story brick building with clean windows and a brass plaque by the door, and walked inside with his helmet in his hand and his boots leaving marks on the polished floor. The receptionist looked up, saw the vest, the patch, the boots. Her hand moved toward the phone on her desk. "I'm here to see Councilman Hargrove," Mason said. "Tell him it's Mason Creed. Tell him I'll wait." She made the call. Her voice was low, turned away, the receiver cupped against her mouth. Mason stood in the lobby and looked at the framed photographs on the wall. City events, ribbon cuttings, charity dinners. Hargrove was in 4 of them, smiling in all 4. The same smile, the same handshake, the same polished confidence of a man who had learned how to wear respectability the way other men wore cologne, applied daily, designed to cover what was underneath. A door opened at the end of the hall. A man in a gray suit stepped out. He was tall, lean, silver-haired, with the kind of posture that comes from military service and never quite leaves. His face was tanned and smooth, his eyes blue and clear, and when he saw Mason standing in the lobby in his leather and his scars, he didn't flinch. He didn't stiffen. He smiled. The same smile. "Mr. Creed," Hargrove extended his hand. "It's been a while." Mason didn't take it. He looked at the hand, clean, manicured, the hand of a man who hadn't touched anything heavier than a pen in 15 years. And then he looked at Hargrove's face. "Saturday afternoon, 3 o'clock. The Black Forge compound is hosting an open community event. Food distribution, open doors. We'd like to invite the city council." Hargrove's smile didn't waver. His hand dropped slowly to his side, and the gesture was so controlled, so practiced, that it looked like choreography. "That's very generous, Mason. Community engagement is something we always encourage." "Good. Then we'll see you there." Mason turned to leave. He was 3 steps from the door when Hargrove spoke again. "Mason." He stopped, didn't turn. "I heard about the inspection scheduled for Monday. I hope that won't interfere with your event. We want to make sure everything at the compound is up to code. For the safety of the community, of course." Mason turned his head, just enough to see Hargrove over his left shoulder, just enough to make eye contact. "Of course." He walked out, got on the Softail, started the engine. The growl filled the street and bounced off the brick buildings and the limestone courthouse and the clean windows of the council offices where a man in a gray suit stood watching from the 2nd floor, his smile finally gone, replaced by something harder and older and far more honest than anything he'd shown in public in 15 years. Mason rode back to the compound. He didn't speed, he didn't weave. He rode at exactly the speed limit, his hands steady on the bars, his jaw set, his mind running through the next 48 hours like a man walking through a building he's about to demolish, checking every wall, every beam, every load-bearing structure, making sure that when it all came down, it fell in the right direction. At the compound, he found what he'd hoped to find and what he'd been afraid to expect. The garage had been transformed. Rowan had commandeered the projector from the back office, an ancient thing that Keeper used for club meetings and the occasional bootleg movie night, and was testing it against the far wall, adjusting the focus until the image was sharp enough to read from 30 feet away. Dutch and Briggs were arranging folding chairs borrowed from the VFW hall down the road, their legs scraping against concrete in a rhythm that sounded like preparation. Keeper was running cable for speakers, his thin frame moving between the workbenches with the quiet efficiency of a man who believed that logistics won wars, not courage. And in the center of it all, sitting on the old couch with a cup of coffee in her bandaged hands, was Nina. She'd come out of the room. She'd washed her face. She'd borrowed a flannel shirt from someone's locker and rolled the sleeves up past her wrapped wrists. And she was talking to Rowan, her voice low and steady, going through the intake forms she'd signed at the outreach center for the past 2 years. Names, dates, box counts, delivery schedules, everything she'd seen and recorded without knowing she was recording evidence. Mason stood in the bay door and watched. The afternoon light came through the opening behind him and fell across the garage floor in a long, pale rectangle, and the people inside moved through it, Rowan typing, Nina talking, Dutch carrying chairs, Briggs limping but refusing to sit down, Keeper threading speaker wire through hooks on the ceiling, and for a moment the scene looked like something else entirely. Not a war room, not a garage, something closer to a kitchen table in a house where people who had no reason to trust each other had decided to try anyway. His phone buzzed, a text from a number he'd dialed that morning. The call he'd made after Nina was found, the number he hadn't used in 11 years. Landing at 6. Send someone. Mason typed back. Dutch will be there. Black truck. Welcome home, Cole. He pocketed the phone. Whoever Cole was, whatever history connected him to Mason and to the events that were accelerating toward Saturday, he was coming. And his arrival meant Mason was reaching for resources he'd held in reserve for over a decade, pulling threads he'd kept hidden from even his closest brothers, assembling something larger than the Black Forge had ever attempted. Eli arrived at 2:47 p.m. Briggs had picked him up on his motorcycle. The boy's first ride, his thin arms wrapped around Briggs's waist, his backpack pressed between them, his eyes wide behind a borrowed helmet that was 2 sizes too big. When Briggs pulled into the compound and Eli climbed off, the boy stood in the gravel lot and looked at the open bay door and the chairs and the projector and the people moving inside and knew, with the instinct of a child who has learned to read rooms because his survival depends on it, that something had changed. Then he saw Nina. He ran, dropped his backpack in the gravel and ran across the lot and through the bay door and into her arms, and she caught him and held him. And they stood there in the middle of the garage, surrounded by motorcycles and folding chairs and evidence of a crime that had been stealing from them for years, and nobody in the room looked at them. Not because they didn't care, because some moments belong only to the people inside them, and watching would have been a kind of theft that none of these men were willing to commit. Mason turned away. He walked to the corkboard, touched the photograph. Sarah, the summer dress, the motorcycle. He pressed his thumb against the edge of the print and held it there, and behind him, he could hear Nina whispering to Eli. Not words he could make out, just the sound of a mother telling her son that she was here, that she was okay, that they were going to be okay. And the sound was so close to the thing he'd lost that his hand began to shake against the photograph, and he had to pull it away and press it flat against his thigh to make it stop. The hours between Friday afternoon and Saturday morning passed, the way hours pass before something irreversible. Slowly, heavily, each one carrying more weight than the last. Rowan worked through the night. The presentation took shape on the projector screen. Footage, documents, maps, financial records, each slide building on the last like bricks in a wall that was being constructed in real time. Keeper cross-referenced every figure. Nina reviewed every delivery log. Dutch ran security drills with Briggs until both men could cover every entrance and exit of the compound in under 90 seconds. At 6 p.m. Friday, Dutch drove to the county airport and came back with Cole. Cole was a black man in his late 50s with a military bearing that hadn't softened in civilian life and hands that were still steady enough to thread a needle in the dark. He wore a plain jacket, no insignia, no patch, no visible affiliation with anything or anyone. But when he walked into the garage and Mason met him at the door, the two men embraced. Briefly, tightly, the way men embrace when they've shared something that doesn't translate into language. And when they separated, Cole looked at the projector screen and the documents and the chairs and the people and said, "Tell me everything." Mason told him. Everything. Kandahar, Hargrove, Sarah, the ledger, the outreach center, the van, the warehouse, the boy, the mother in the storage unit, the inspection. Saturday. All of it laid out in the fluorescent light of the garage, while the November wind pushed against the walls, and the coffee grew cold, and Cole listened without interrupting, his dark eyes moving from face to face around the room, reading each person the way a general reads terrain. When Mason finished, Cole was quiet for a long time. Then he opened his jacket and pulled out a leather folder. Inside were documents, military service records, incident reports, after-action reviews. He laid them on the table. "After you left the service," Cole said, "I stayed. I spent 6 years trying to reopen the investigation into the Kandahar supply diversions. I was blocked at every level, but I kept copies of everything I submitted, every request, every denial, every signature of every officer who shut it down." He looked at Mason, including the signature of the officer who signed Sarah Vasquez's casualty report and classified her personal effects as destroyed when we both know they weren't. Mason's breath stopped. The garage was so quiet, the fluorescent light sounded like screaming. "That signature," Cole said, "is Richard Hargrove's." The name landed in the room and detonated. Not with noise, with silence. The kind of silence that happens after an explosion, when the air itself is stunned and needs a moment to remember how to carry sound. Rowan was the first to move. She took Cole's documents, laid them next to Sarah's ledger, and began photographing everything. Keeper started building a timeline on his legal pad. Dates from Kandahar, alongside dates from Harlan County, the two threads of Hargrove's career laid out in parallel, showing the same pattern repeated across 15 years and 2 continents. Steal from the vulnerable, paper over the evidence, destroy anyone who got close to the truth. Mason stood at the corkboard. His hand was on the photograph again, but this time he didn't just touch it. He took it down, held it in both hands, looked at Sarah's face, her smile, her eyes, the way the sunlight hit her hair in a photograph taken on a day when the future still looked possible, and turned it over. On the back, in Sarah's handwriting, 2 words: "Finish this." He'd read those words 1,000 times. He'd never understood them as a command. He'd understood them as grief, as longing, as the last trace of a woman who knew she was running out of time and wanted to leave something behind that would outlast what was coming. But tonight, standing in a garage full of people who'd chosen to fight, holding a photograph of the woman who'd started it all, Mason read the words differently. Not as a message from the past, as instructions for Saturday. He pinned the photograph back on the corkboard, turned around, looked at the room, at Dutch and Briggs and Gentry and Keeper and Rowan and Cole and Nina and Eli, who'd fallen asleep on the old couch with his head on his mother's lap and his sneakers still on, his backpack on the floor beside him, his phone, the cracked phone that had started everything, clutched in his hand even in sleep. "Tomorrow," Mason said. 3 o'clock. We opened the doors. Nobody argued. Nobody asked what would happen if Hargrove sent people. Nobody asked what would happen after. They knew. They all knew. Saturday wasn't a plan. It was a point of no return disguised as a community event, and every person in this garage had already crossed the line that separated caution from commitment. The engines outside were silent. The wind had died. The compound sat in the November dark like a ship at anchor, waiting for a tide that was already turning. And 12 hours from now, in this garage, in front of a crowd of people who'd been lied to for years, a 12-year-old boy with a cracked phone and trembling hands was going to press play and tear the roof off everything Richard Hargrove had built. The only question left was whether the man in the gray suit would be in the room when it happened, and what he would do when the walls came down. Saturday. 3 o'clock. The bay doors opened. Mason stood at the threshold with his hands at his sides and watched them come. Not a flood. A trickle at first. 2 women from the outreach center who'd seen the flyers Keeper had slipped under doors at dawn, walking slowly, unsure, their eyes scanning the compound like they expected to find something dangerous and were trying to decide how quickly they could leave. Behind them, an older man in a canvas jacket who lived 3 blocks from the center and had been picking up groceries there every Thursday for 2 years. Behind him, a young couple with a toddler on the woman's hip, the man's jaw tight, his hand on his wife's back, ready to turn around at the first wrong signal. Mason didn't smile, didn't wave, didn't perform. He stood in the doorway in his leather jacket and his boots and his scars, and he nodded. Once. The way you nod at someone when you're saying, "I know you came here scared and I'm not going to make it worse." They came in. By 3:15, there were 20 people. By 3:30, 40. They filled the folding chairs that Dutch and Briggs had arranged in uneven rows across the garage floor. They stood along the walls between the motorcycles, their coats still on, their breath still visible in the cold air that pushed through the open bay doors. Children sat on the concrete floor with their legs crossed, looking up at the projector screen the way children look at things they don't yet understand but know are important. The garage smelled like engine oil and coffee and the sharp, clean bite of November air mixing with the warmth of bodies gathered in a space that had never held this many people at once. Nina sat in the front row. Her wrists were still wrapped in gauze. She'd borrowed a jacket from someone. Too big, the sleeves covering her hands, and she held Eli's arm with a grip that said she hadn't fully decided whether being here was brave or reckless and wouldn't let go until she figured it out. Eli sat beside her, his backpack between his feet, his cracked phone in his jacket pocket, his face the face of a 12-year-old boy who was about to do something that most adults spend their entire lives avoiding. Rowan stood next to the projector, her laptop open on a toolbox, her canvas bag at her feet. She'd slept maybe 3 hours in the last 48. Her eyes had the glazed, electric look of someone running on caffeine and conviction and nothing else. She'd changed her shirt. That was the only concession to the occasion. Everything else, the uncombed hair, the bitten nails, the shoes that hadn't been new in 2 years, stayed exactly as it was. She wasn't here to look credible. She was here to be right. Cole stood against the back wall, arms folded, watching the door. He'd said almost nothing since the night before, when he'd laid his documents on the table and changed the shape of everything. He was here as a witness, a corroborator. A man whose military service record and 6 years of blocked investigation requests would answer the question that Hargrove's lawyers would ask first. Why should anyone believe a motorcycle club? Keeper ran the projector. Gentry and Dutch flanked the bay doors. Briggs sat on the old couch with his bad leg elevated on a milk crate, a phone in his hand, recording everything. At 3:42, a black sedan pulled into the gravel lot. The engine idled for 30 seconds. Then the door opened and Richard Hargrove stepped out. He was wearing the gray suit. He was alone. No aides, no lawyers, no county officials. Just a man in a suit walking across a gravel lot toward a garage full of the people he'd been stealing from. And the walk was steady, unhurried, the walk of someone who still believed he could control whatever happened in the next hour. Mason met him at the bay door. The two men stood face to face in the November light, one in leather, one in wool, one with scars, one with a smile that he put on the way other people put on shoes, and neither of them spoke for 5 full seconds. The crowd inside the garage went quiet. The children stopped fidgeting. The projector hummed. "Councilman," Mason said. "Thank you for coming." "Wouldn't miss it." Hargrove looked past Mason's shoulder at the rows of chairs, the families, the screen. His smile held. "Community engagement is important to me. Always has been. I know exactly what's important to you." Hargrove's smile flickered, a hairline crack in the porcelain. Then it was back, smooth as glass, and he walked past Mason into the garage and took a seat in the last row, crossing one leg over the other, folding his hands in his lap, the picture of civic participation. Mason turned to face the room. He didn't have a microphone. He didn't need one. The garage had the acoustics of a concrete box, and when he spoke, his voice reached every corner without effort. "My name is Mason Creed. Most of you know who I am. Most of you know what this place is. And most of you have heard things about the Black Forge riders that would make you think twice about walking through that door." He paused. Let the words settle. "You came anyway. That means something. So I'm not going to waste your time. I'm going to show you what's been happening to the food your families were supposed to receive. And then I'm going to introduce you to the person who found out." He looked at Eli. The boy's face was white. His hands were in his lap, pressed together so hard the knuckles had gone pale. Nina's grip on his arm tightened. Mason held the boy's eyes for a moment, not pushing, not demanding, just being there, the way a lighthouse is there, not moving toward the ship, but showing it where the rocks are. And Eli nodded. Mason stepped aside. Rowan pressed a key on her laptop. The projector filled the wall. The first image was the van. White, cargo. Parked at the loading dock of the Harlan County Community Outreach Center. A timestamp in the corner. Tuesday, 4:47 p.m. 43 boxes being loaded by men in volunteer vests who didn't appear on any volunteer roster. Rowan narrated. Her voice was calm, precise, stripped of everything except facts. She walked the room through 9 days of evidence the way a surgeon walks through an operation. Step by step, instrument by instrument, no wasted motion. The van's route, the warehouse on Industrial Row, the shell companies, the phantom distribution centers, the financial trail that connected donated goods to liquidation sales to bank accounts controlled by a trust registered in Delaware. The room was silent. Not the polite silence of an audience, the stunned silence of people recognizing their own lives in the evidence on the screen. A woman in the third row put her hand over her mouth. The man in the canvas jacket leaned forward in his chair, his elbows on his knees, his eyes narrowing. The young couple with the toddler looked at each other and then looked at the screen and then looked at each other again, and the woman's arms tightened around the child. Then Rowan reached the slide that changed everything. A side-by-side comparison. On the left, the Bridgepoint Charitable Trust Board of Directors. Names, photographs, titles. On the right, the ownership records for Ridgeline Holdings, LLC, the shell company that controlled the warehouses. The names matched. Every single one. And at the top of both lists, smiling out of his official counsel portrait, was Richard Hargrove. The room turned, not all at once, in pieces, head swiveling toward the back row, where Hargrove sat with his legs still crossed and his hands still folded, his face undergoing a transformation that happened in stages, the smile holding, then thinning, then setting into something rigid and artificial, like a mask that had been glued on too tight. His eyes moved from the screen to the faces in the crowd, to Mason, and back to the screen. And in that circuit, something broke in the performance he'd been giving for 15 years. He stood up. This is absurd. His voice was controlled, calibrated. The voice of a man who'd given speeches and answered questions and deflected accusations with the ease of someone who'd been doing it since before some of these people were born. This is a disgruntled motorcycle club fabricating evidence to deflect attention from their own activities. I've served this community for 11 years. Councilman. Cole's voice came from the back wall. He hadn't moved, hadn't raised his voice. But something in the timbre, the authority of a man who'd spent decades in rooms where lying had consequences that couldn't be papered over, cut through Hargrove's protest like a blade through cloth. My name is Colonel James Cole, retired United States Army. I served in the same theater of operations as Mason Creed and as yourself, and I have in my possession 6 years of documentation showing that the supply diversion scheme you operated in Kandahar province follows the identical pattern, identical methods, identical financial structures, identical paperwork, as the operation currently running through Bridgepoint Charitable Trust. Hargrove's face changed again. The mask cracked further. Beneath it was something that Eli, watching from the front row, would remember for the rest of his life. Not anger, not fear, but the terrible, disorienting shock of a man who has been standing on a floor he believed was solid and has just felt it give way beneath his feet. Those are classified military records. You have no right. I have every right. These are my own investigation requests and the formal denials I received, none of which are classified. What is classified is the casualty report you signed for Sarah Vasquez, a civilian contractor whose personal effects you ordered destroyed after she confronted you about the diversions. Effects that included a handwritten ledger documenting every transaction in the Kandahar operation. Cole reached into his jacket and produced a single photograph. He held it up. Sarah, the summer dress, the motorcycle, the same photograph that had hung on Mason's corkboard for 15 years. This woman tried to stop you. She disappeared, and you signed the paper that made her disappearance go away. The garage was so quiet Eli could hear the projector's cooling fan. He could hear the toddler breathing in the young woman's arms. He could hear the wind outside pushing against the bay doors. He could hear his own heartbeat, loud and fast. The heartbeat of a boy who had followed a van on a bicycle because nobody else would, and was now watching the lie that had been feeding on his community collapse in front of 100 witnesses. Hargrove looked at the door, at the bay opening, at the gravel lot beyond. Calculating distance, calculating options, calculating the gap between where he stood and the black sedan that could take him somewhere else, anywhere else, away from this garage and these faces, and the photograph of a woman he'd erased from the record 15 years ago. Mason stepped into the gap, not aggressively, not theatrically. He simply moved, the way a door closes, and stood between Hargrove and the exit. His hands were at his sides. His face was calm. His eyes held nothing except the 15 years that had led to this moment. The silence, the waiting, the engines fixed at 3 in the morning, the photograph touched every night, the boy on the bicycle, the mother in the storage unit, every single day of watching this man smile and shake hands and steal. "Sit down, Richard." Hargrove looked at Mason, at the leather jacket, at the patch, at the scars on his hands, at the room full of people who were looking at him, really looking, for the first time past the suit and the title and the smile and seeing what was underneath. He sat down. Rowan finished the presentation. The last slide was Eli's original footage, the van, the warehouse, the deliberate cruise past the Black Forge compound, the shaky camera, the bad lighting, the honest, unpolished evidence of a 12-year-old kid who'd seen something wrong and refused to pretend he hadn't. When the video ended, the room was still. Then the woman in the third row, Mrs. Delgado, 4 kids, husband gone since spring, stood up. She didn't say anything. She just stood there, looking at the screen, her hand still over her mouth, tears running silently down her face. The man in the canvas jacket stood up next. Then the young couple. Then a teenager in the 4th row who'd been sitting with his arms crossed the entire time. One by one, the people of Harlan County stood up in a motorcycle garage surrounded by chrome and leather and oil stains and the smell of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. And the standing wasn't applause and it wasn't protest. It was witness. Every person on their feet was saying, "I saw this. I was here. This happened." Briggs, still on the couch, kept recording. Hargrove didn't stand. He sat in his chair in the last row with his hands in his lap and his face the color of old paper, and his eyes fixed on a point on the concrete floor that didn't exist. And for the first time in 15 years, he looked exactly like what he was. A man sitting in a room full of the people he'd hurt, with nowhere to go and nothing left to say. The aftermath moved faster than anyone expected. Briggs's footage hit the internet before the families had finished leaving the compound. Rowan's phone rang 11 times in the first hour. 3 local reporters, 2 state journalists, a producer from a regional news affiliate, and 5 numbers she didn't recognize. By Sunday morning, the county sheriff's office had received formal complaints from 37 families. By Sunday afternoon, the state attorney general's office had opened a preliminary inquiry. By Monday morning, when the county code enforcement team arrived at the Black Forge compound for the scheduled inspection, they found the bay doors open, the garage clean, and 40 community members waiting with signs that read, "This is our center now." The inspection was canceled. The investigators went to the warehouse on Industrial Row instead. They found all 4 storage facilities, every box, every shipping manifest, every forged distribution report. The evidence that Rowan and Keeper had assembled was corroborated by the physical trail inside the warehouses. Inventory tags matching Bridgepoint's records, goods still in their original packaging, some of them bearing the logos of the charitable organizations that had donated them, organizations whose donors had believed their contributions were feeding families. Hargrove was taken into custody on Wednesday, not by local police, by federal agents who arrived in unmarked vehicles at 6 a.m. and walked into his house through the front door while his coffee was still brewing. The charges would take months to finalize: fraud, theft, conspiracy, obstruction. But the arrest happened in the quiet hours of a November morning, with no cameras and no audience, just a man in handcuffs walking across his own lawn in the cold. 3 members of the Bridgepoint board were arrested the same week. Mrs. Calloway resigned from the outreach center on Thursday and was served a subpoena on Friday. The chief of staff to the state senator retained a lawyer and stopped returning calls. Cole's military documents were submitted to the Department of Defense Inspector General, along with Sarah's ledger. A formal review was opened. It would take years. It would be slow, bureaucratic, frustrating, and imperfect. But it would exist. A file with her name on it would sit in an office where people whose job was to find the truth would have to look at it. Sarah Vasquez would no longer be an administrative closure. She would be an open case. Mason didn't celebrate. None of them did. There was no moment of triumph, no dramatic vindication, no catharsis that arrived clean and whole and satisfying. What there was, instead, was a Saturday evening, the Saturday after the gathering, when the garage fell quiet for the first time in 2 weeks, and Mason found himself standing at the workbench, his hands flat on the surface, staring at the empty space where the documents had been. The plywood table was bare. The folding chairs were stacked against the wall. The projector was dark. The corkboard still held the photograph of Sarah, but the other papers, the maps, the schedules, the notes, were gone, submitted as evidence, absorbed into a process that was now larger than the Black Forge and beyond any single person's control. Dutch found him there, stood beside him without speaking for a minute. 2. 3. Then he set a fresh cup of coffee on the workbench, hot, black, in a mug with no handle, and said, "She'd be proud of you." Mason picked up the coffee, held it in both hands, let the heat soak into his scarred fingers. He didn't answer for a long time. She'd be angry it took 15 years. Yeah, she would, but she'd be proud anyway. Mason drank the coffee. It was bitter and too hot and exactly right. In the weeks that followed, the Black Forge compound became something it had never been. Mason opened the garage 3 days a week as a community distribution center. Not the fraudulent kind, not the kind with phantom addresses and forged inspection reports, but a real one. Visible, transparent, every box accounted for, every delivery logged in a ledger that anyone could walk in and read. The donations came slowly at first. A case of canned goods from a church group, 10 bags of rice from a grocery store that was clearing inventory, a pallet of bottled water from a distributor who'd seen the news coverage and wanted to help. Then they came faster. Organizations that had given to Bridgepoint redirected their contributions. Families who'd been picking up half-empty bags at the outreach center came to the compound instead, and they left with full ones. Nina ran the intake desk. She sat at a folding table near the bay door with a clipboard. A new clipboard, with clean forms she'd printed at the library, and signed families in with the same steady hand she'd always used, except now every box she logged went where it was supposed to go. Her wrists healed. The gauze came off. The bruises faded. What didn't fade was the way she held herself. Straighter, sharper, the posture of a woman who had been tied to a chair in the dark and had come out of it not broken, but refined, the way heat refines metal, burning away everything that isn't essential. Eli helped after school. He rode his BMX to the compound every Tuesday and Thursday. The same bike, the same cracked phone in his pocket, the same worn sneakers, and sorted donations with the same mechanical rhythm he'd used at the outreach center, except now the fluorescent lights above him worked and the shelves behind him were full. He didn't talk much. He'd never talked much. But he moved through the garage with an ease that surprised everyone, weaving between the motorcycles and the workbenches and the folding chairs like he'd been navigating this space his whole life. Like the oil and the chrome and the smell of leather were as familiar to him as the hallway of his apartment. Gentry never formally apologized to Mason for walking out. Mason never formally apologized to Gentry for 15 years of silence. What happened instead was smaller and truer. On a Tuesday afternoon, Gentry walked into the garage carrying 2 boxes of donated blankets on his taped hands, set them on the workbench, looked at Mason, and said, "Where do these go?" And Mason said, "Third shelf, behind the canned goods." And Gentry put them there. And that was it. No speeches, no handshakes, no dramatic reconciliation, just a man carrying blankets for families he didn't know. In a building led by a man he'd decided to keep trusting, and the quiet understanding that forgiveness doesn't have a sound. It has a shape, and the shape is showing up. Briggs got his leg looked at. Keeper made him. Drove him to a VA clinic 2 counties over and sat in the waiting room for 3 hours reading a book about naval intelligence while Briggs argued with the doctor who told him the limp was going to be permanent unless he agreed to physical therapy. He agreed. He complained about it constantly. He went every week. Keeper stayed exactly the same. Thin, quiet, precise. He maintained the distribution logs with the same invisible efficiency he'd brought to everything else. A man who believed that the world was held together not by grand gestures, but by small, accurate records kept by people who didn't need to be noticed. Rowan published the story. Not in the paper that had fired her, they called, she declined, but in a regional investigative outlet that gave her the space and the byline and the editorial independence to tell it the way it needed to be told. The piece ran long. It named names. It included photographs of the warehouses, the shell company filings, the military documents. It was shared 14,000 times in the first week. A national wire service picked it up. An editor from a magazine she'd admired since journalism school sent her an email that said simply, "Welcome back." She didn't move to Harlan County. She didn't set up shop in the garage. She went back to her apartment, the one with the destroyed car that the insurance company was still arguing about, and started working on the next story. But she came back to the compound every few weeks. She'd sit on the old couch with a cup of keeper's coffee and talk to Nina about the intake numbers, or argue with Dutch about something that didn't matter, or stand next to Mason at the workbench and say nothing at all, which was its own kind of conversation. Cole returned to his life outside Harlan County. He left the way he'd arrived, quietly, without ceremony, in a plain jacket with no insignia. Before he left, he stood in front of the corkboard and looked at Sarah's photograph for a long time. Then he turned to Mason and said, "You kept her alive in this room for 15 years. Now, let her rest." Mason took the photograph down that night. He didn't throw it away. He put it in the footlocker in his room, next to the ledger, next to a folded letter in handwriting that had faded but never become illegible. He closed the lid, sat on the cot, looked at the space on the corkboard where the photograph had been. A rectangle of slightly darker paint, the outline of something that had hung there long enough to leave a mark. The empty space stayed empty. He didn't fill it. Some marks are supposed to be visible. On a Thursday evening in early December, Mason locked the distribution center, turned off the fluorescent lights, and walked out through the bay door into the cold. The compound was quiet. The motorcycles sat under the overhang, chrome catching the last light of a sky that was turning from gray to deep blue. The gravel lot was empty except for Eli's BMX, leaned against the fence the way it always was, casually, carelessly, the way a child leaves things in a place where they feel safe. Eli was sitting on the curb outside the gate, his backpack beside him, his phone in his hands, watching something on the cracked screen. He looked up when Mason came through the door. "Mom's running late, dry cleaner." "I know." Mason sat down on the curb next to him. The concrete was cold. The sky was getting darker. Somewhere down the block, a streetlight that had been broken for months flickered on. Somebody had finally replaced it, and the new bulb threw a steady, warm circle onto the sidewalk that hadn't been there before. They sat there, man and boy, leather and sneakers, scars and a cracked phone screen. The sound of traffic from the highway was faint and steady, and beneath it, if you listened, you could hear the tick of cooling engines from the garage, the last mechanical heartbeat of a day that was winding down. "Mason." "Yeah." "Is it over?" Mason looked at the street, at the fixed streetlight, at the compound behind them, where the bay doors were closed and the motorcycles were covered and the corkboard had an empty rectangle where a photograph used to be. "The hard part is, what's the rest?" "The rest is showing up. Every day. Doing the work. Making sure the shelves stay full and the books stay clean and the doors stay open." He paused. "That's harder than the hard part. Just quieter." Eli thought about this. His phone screen dimmed and went dark. He didn't turn it back on. "I'm glad I went to the garage that day," he said. "When I showed you the video, everyone told me to stop asking questions, but I couldn't." "I know." "Were you scared when you saw what was on the phone?" Mason looked at the boy, at his watchful eyes, at his worn sneakers, at the hands that had been steady enough to hold a camera in the dark and brave enough to carry what it captured to the last door anyone would have expected him to knock on. "Yeah," Mason said. "I was scared." "You didn't look scared. That's the trick. You don't have to look like what you feel. You just have to feel it and keep going." Nina's car turned the corner. The headlights swept across the gravel lot and lit up the fence and the BMX and the two figures on the curb. She pulled in, rolled down the window, and looked at her son sitting next to a man in a leather jacket on a cold curb in front of a motorcycle compound, and whatever she felt. And it was complicated, layered, the feeling of a mother who has watched her child become braver than she was prepared for, She kept it behind her eyes and said, "Get in. Soup's not going to make itself." Eli stood up, grabbed his backpack, looked at Mason one more time. "See you Tuesday?" "Tuesday." The boy got in the car. The door closed. Nina pulled out of the lot, and the taillights shrank down the street until they turned a corner and were gone. Mason sat on the curb for another minute. The streetlight hummed above him. The December air smelled like cold metal and distant wood smoke, and the faintest trace of engine oil that clung to everything within 100 yards of the compound and probably always would. He stood up, stretched his back, felt every year in his joints and every mile in his bones. He walked to his motorcycle, the black Softail, no chrome, no polish, nothing that caught light. He sat on it the way he had on the night this started, without starting the engine, just holding the handlebars, feeling the cold metal through his gloves, letting the weight and the balance and the stillness do what words couldn't. Then he started it. The engine turned over with its low, deep growl, the sound that traveled through the empty streets of Harlan County the way it always had. Not as a threat, not as a warning, but as a presence. The sound of someone keeping watch, the sound of someone still here. He rode out of the compound and into the December dark, past the fixed streetlight and the library and the outreach center that was being restructured under new management, past the courthouse where the flag was still snapping in the wind, past the railroad crossing where the warning lights had finally been repaired, and out toward the edge of town where the road opened up and the sky spread wide and the cold air hit his face like a hand pressing him forward into whatever came next. Behind him, the compound sat in the dark. The bay doors were closed, the lights were off. The motorcycles rested under their overhang, and inside, on the corkboard, the empty rectangle where Sarah's photograph had hung caught the faint glow of the security light through the window. A small, bright absence in the dark, the shape of something that had been carried long enough to leave its mark, and set down gently enough to let the space remain. The engine faded. The street went quiet. The streetlight hummed, and in a small apartment 4 blocks away, a 12-year-old boy sat at a kitchen table eating soup with his mother, his cracked phone on the counter, his sneakers by the door, his backpack on the floor where he'd dropped it. The ordinary mess of a life that had been, for a few terrifying weeks, extraordinary, and was now allowed to be ordinary again. The soup was hot. The apartment was warm, and outside in the December dark, the sound of a single Harley faded into the distance like a promise that didn't need to be spoken to be kept.